Hello, I'm Vikram Divecha. I'm an artist based in Dubai, and I'm here in relation to my exhibition titled Short Circuits. It's my first survey show, which is showing at Jameel Arts Center. It was curated by Don Ross and Lucas Morin. And the exhibition looks at how I negotiate with the city, engage with people, or try to work with systems and processes to make a kind of art. However, today I want to speak about a painter. I want to read about a painter, and painters and painting have always held a special place for me. Of course, I really have a lot of respect and interest in painting, but perhaps the idea of a painter was always the idea of an artist from me from a young age. I was always interested in knowing how a painter engages with time, with space, how they have these concerns and questions while living in cities, especially painters post the late 19th century. And I see them as these unprofessionals, but also so involved in a city. In fact, in the exhibition, there was a work that revolved around a painter, and the question of time was so important over there. Or it revolved around actually a painting specifically, but I won't get into that. Today, I want to read about an important painter. His name is Francis Bacon, the 20th century painter. And the book is called The Logic of Sensation. It's written by an important French philosopher, Gilles Deleuze. And he thinks about this book not as a book on art history, but perhaps a work by itself, which takes Francis Bacon's paintings as a departure point. And I haven't read the entire book. I've read a few chapters, and I keep coming back to those chapters again and again. And I'm interested in the questions of how does he deal or struggle with this question of representation, the question of the body and space, the interiority of space, or the psychology of the interior, and also this question of what else is possible with paint itself. Perhaps that echoes very strongly with me because what I'm trying to think through my practice is what else is possible with the city itself. Anyhow, let's jump into the chapters. So before I read the first chapter, I want to mention that this book was originally published in 1981 in French, and it had two parts to it. There was one book with a text, and the second book had, I think, 80 to 90 plates, images of Bacon's paintings and perhaps some other paintings as well. And it was a beautiful system where you would read and refer back to a plate and come back. And in the text, he mentions so many works to refer to, which is perhaps a process that won't come through in this reading, but I thought you all should know about that. Chapter 1, The Round Area, the Ring. The round area and its analogues, distinction between the figure, the figurative, the fact, the question of matters of fact, the three elements of painting, structure, figure, and contour, role of the fields. A round area often delimits the place where the person, that is to say, the figure, is seated, lying down, doubled over, or in some other position. This round or oval area takes up more or less space. It can extend beyond the edges of the painting or occupy the center of the triptych. It is often duplicated or even replaced by the roundness of the chair on which the person is seated, or by the oval of the bed on which the person is lying. It can be dispersed in the small discs that surround a part of the person's body, or in the gyratory spirals that encircle the bodies. Even the two peasants in Two Men Working in a Field form a figure only in relation to an awkward plot of land, tightly confined within the oval of a pot. In short, the painting is composed like a circus ring, a kind of amphitheater as place. It is a very simple technique that consists in isolating the figure. There are other techniques of isolation, putting the figure inside a cube, or rather inside a parallel pipette. A parallel pipette is a three-dimensional shape, such as a cube, which is skewed. This word will return in the text. So I'll just repeat that line. There are other techniques of isolation, putting the figure inside a cube, or rather inside a parallel pipette of glass or ice, sticking it onto a rail or a stretched out bar as if on the magnetic arc of an infinite circle, or combining all these means, the round area, the cube, and the bar, as in Bacon's strangely flared and curved armchairs. These are all places. In any case, Bacon does not hide the fact that these techniques are rather rudimentary, despite the subtlety of their combinations. The important point is that they do not consign the figure to immobility, but on the contrary, render sensible a kind of progression and exploration of the figure within the place or upon itself. It is an operative field. The relation of the figure is to its isolating place defines a fact. The fact is what takes place is. Thus isolated, the figure becomes an image, an icon. Not only is the painting an isolated reality, and not only does the triptych have three isolated panels, which above all must not be united in a single frame, but the figure itself is isolated in the painting by the round area or the parallel pipette. Why? Bacon often explains that it is to avoid the figurative, illustrative, and narrative character of the character the figure would necessarily have if it were not isolated. Painting has neither a model to represent nor a story to narrate. It thus has two possible ways of escaping the figurative: toward pure form or through abstraction, or toward the purely figural through extraction or isolation. If the painter keeps to the figure, if he or she opts for the second path, it will be to oppose the figural to the figurative. Isolating the figure will be the primary requirement. The figurative representation implies the relationship of an image to an object that is supposed to illustrate, but it also implies the relationship of an image to other images in a composite whole that assigns a specific object to each of them. Narration is a correlate of illustration. A story always slips into, or tends to slip into, the space between two figures in order to animate the illustrated whole. Isolation is thus the simplest means, necessary though not sufficient, to break with representation, to disrupt narration, to escape illustration, to liberate the figure, to stick to the fact. Clearly, the problem is more complicated than this. Is there not another type of relationship between figures, one that would not be narrative and from which no figuration would follow? Diverse figures that would spring from the same fact, that would belong to one and the same unique fact, rather than telling a story or referring to different objects in a figurative whole. Non-narrative relationships between figures and non-illustrative relationships between the figures and the fact. Coupled figures have always been a part of Bacon's work, but they do not tell a story. Moreover, there is a relationship of great intensity between the separate panels of a triptych, although the relationship has nothing narrative about it. Bacon modestly acknowledges that classical painting often succeeded in drawing this other type of relationship between figures, and that this is still the task of the painting of the future. Open quote. Of course, so many of the great paintings have been done with a number of figures on a canvas, and of course every painter longs to do that. But the story that is already being told between one figure and another begins to cancel out the possibilities of what can be done with the paint on its own. And this is a very great difficulty. But at any moment, somebody will come along and be able to put a number of figures on a canvas. Close quote. What is this other type of relationship? A relationship between coupled or distinct figures. Let us call these new relationships matters of fact, as opposed to intelligible relationships of objects or ideas. Even if we acknowledge that, to a large degree, Bacon had already conquered this domain, he did so under more complex aspects than those we have yet considered. We are still at the simple aspect of isolation. A figure is isolated within a ring, upon a chair, bed, or sofa, inside a circle or parallelepiped. It occupies only a part of the painting. What then fills the rest of the painting? A certain number of possibilities are already annulled or without interest for Bacon. What fills the rest of the painting will be neither a landscape or the correlate of the figure, nor a ground from which the form will emerge, nor a formless chiaroscuro, a thickness of color on which shadows would play, a texture on which variation would play. Yet we are moving ahead too quickly, for there are indeed in Bacon's early works landscape figures like the Van Gogh of 1957. They're extremely shaded textures, as in Figure in Landscape from 1945, and Figure Study 1 that was made between 1945 and 1946. There are thicknesses and densities like those of Head 2 from 1949, and above all, there is that alleged period of 10 years that, according to Sylvester, was dominated by the somber, the dark, and the tonal before Bacon returned to the clear and precise. But destiny can sometimes pass through detours that seem to contradict it. For Bacon's landscapes are a preparation for what will later appear as a set of short, involuntary free marks lining the canvas, asignifying traits that are devoid of any illustrative or narrative function. Hence the importance of grass and the irremediably grassy character of these landscapes. Landscape 1952, Study for a Figure in a Landscape 1952, Study of a Baboon 1953, Two Figures in the Grass from 1954. As for the textures, the thick, the dark, and the blurry, they are already preparing for the great technique of local scrubbing with a rag, whisk broom, or brush, in which the thickness is spread out over a non-figurative zone. Clearly, these two techniques of local scrubbing and asignifying traits belong to an original system which is neither that of the landscape nor that of the formless or the ground, although by virtue of their autonomy they are apt to make a landscape or to make a ground or even to make darkness. In fact, the rest of the painting is systematically occupied by large fields of bright, uniform, and motionless color. Thin and hard, these fields have a structuring and spatializing function. They are not beneath, behind, or beyond the figure, but are strictly to the side of it, rather all around it, and are thus grasped in a close view, a tactile or haptic view, just as the figure itself is. At this stage, when one moves from the figure to the fields of color, there is no relation of depth or distance, no incertitude of light and shadow. Even the shadows and blacks are not dark. I tried to make the shadows as present as the figure. That's a quote from Bacon. If the fields function as a background, they do so by virtue of their strict correlation with the figures. It is the correlation of two sectors on a single plane equally close. This correlation, this connection, is itself provided by the place, by the ring or round area, which is the common limit of two, their contour. This is what Bacon says in a very important statement to which we will frequently recur. He distinguishes three fundamental elements in his painting, which are the material structure, the round contour, and the raised image. If we think in sculptural terms, we would have to say the armature, the pedestal, which would be mobile, and the figure, which would move along the armature together with the pedestal. If we had to illustrate them, and to a certain degree this is necessary, as in Man with Dog of 1953, we would say a sidewalk, some pools, and the people who emerge from the pools on the way to the daily round. We will see later what the various elements of the system have to do with the Egyptian art, Byzantine art, and so forth. But what concerns us here is this absolute proximity, this co-precision of the field that functions as a ground, and the figure that functions as a form, on a single plane that is viewed at close range. It is this system, this coexistence of two immediately adjacent sectors that encloses space, that constitutes an absolutely closed and revolving space, much more so than if one had proceeded with the somber, the dark, or the indistinct. This is why there's indeed a certain blurriness in Bacon. There are even two kinds of blurriness, but they belong to this highly precise system. In the first case, the blur is obtained not by indistinctness, but on the contrary, by the operation that consists in destroying clarity by clarity, as in the man with the pig's head in the self-portrait of 1973, or the treatment of crumpled newspapers, as Leary says, that typographic characters are clearly drawn, and it is their very mechanical precision that stands opposed to their legibility. In the other case, the blur is obtained by the techniques of free marks or scrubbing, both of which are also among the precise elements of the system. We will see that there is yet a third case. Chapter 2, Note on Figuration in Past Painting, Painting, Religion and Photography on Two Misconceptions. Painting has to extract the figure from the figurative, but Bacon invokes two developments which seem to indicate that modern painting has a different relation to figuration or illustration than the painting of the past. First, photography has taken over the illustrative and documentary role, so that modern painting no longer needs to fulfill this function, which still burdened earlier painters. Second, painting used to be conditioned by certain religious possibilities that still give a pictorial meaning to figuration, whereas modern painting is an atheistic game. Yet, it is by no means certain that these two ideas taken from Malraux are adequate. On the one hand, such activities are in competition with each other, and one art would never be content to assume a role abandoned by another. It is hard to imagine an activity that would take over a function relinquished by a superior art. The photograph, though instantaneous, has a completely different ambition than representing, illustrating, or narrating. And when Bacon speaks of his own use of photographs and of the relationships between photography and painting, he has much more profound things to say. On the other hand, the link between the pictorial element and religious sentiment in past painting in turn seems poorly defined by the hypothesis of figurative function that was simply sanctified by faith. Consider an extreme example: El Greco's The Burial of the Count of Orgaz, made between 1586 to 1588. A horizontal divides the painting into two parts, upper and lower, celestial and terrestrial. In the lower half, there is indeed a figuration or narration that represents burial of the count, although all the coefficients of bodily deformation and notably elongation are already at work. In the upper half, where the count is received by Christ, there is a wild liberation, a total emancipation. The figures are lifted up and elongated, refined without measure, beyond all constraint. Despite appearances, there is no longer a story to tell. The figures are relieved of their representative role and enter directly into relation with an order of celestial sensations. This is what Christian painting had already discovered in the religious sentiment, a properly pictorial atheism where one could adhere literally to the idea that God must not be represented. With God, but also with Christ, the Virgin, and even hell, lines, colors, and movements are freed from the demands of representation. The figures are lifted up or doubled over or contorted, freed from all figuration. They no longer have anything to represent or narrate, since in this domain they are content to refer to the existing code of the Church. Thus, in themselves, they no longer have to do with anything but sensations, celestial, infernal, or terrestrial sensations. Everything is made to pass through the code. The religious sentiment is painted in all the colors of the world. One must not say, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. It is just the opposite. For with God, everything is permitted. It is with God that everything is permitted, not only morally, since violences and infamies always find a holy justification, but aesthetically in a much more important manner, because the divine figures are wrought by a free creative work, by a fantasy in which everything is permitted. Christ's body is fashioned by a truly diabolical inspiration that makes it pass through all the areas of sensation, through all the levels of different feelings. Consider two further examples. In Giotto's stigmatization of St. Francis, made between 1297 to 1300, Christ is transformed into a kite in the sky, a veritable airplane which sends the stigmata to St. Francis, while the hatched lines that trace the path to the stigmata are like free marks, which the saint manipulates so as if they are the strings of the airplane kite. Or Tintoretto's creation of the animals from 1550. God is like a referee firing the gun at the start of a handicapped race, in which the birds, or in Tintoretto's creation of the animals from 1550. God is like a referee firing the gun at the start of a handicapped race, in which the birds and the fish take off first, while the dog, the rabbits, the cow, and the unicorn await their turn. Thus, we cannot say that it was religious sentiment that sustained figuration in the painting of the past. On the contrary, it made possible a liberation of figures, the emergence of figures freed from all figuration. Nor can we say that the renunciation of figuration was easier for modern painting as a game. On the contrary, modern painting is invaded and besieged by photographs and cliches that are already lodged on the canvas before the painter even begins to work. In fact, it would be a mistake to think that the painter works on a white and virgin surface. The entire surface is already invested virtually with all kinds of cliches, which the painter will have to break with. This is exactly what Bacon says when he speaks of the photograph. It is not a figuration of what one sees, it is what modern man sees. It is not dangerous simply because it is figurative, but because it claims to reign over vision, and thus to reign over painting. Having renounced the religious sentiment, but besieged by the photograph, modern painting finds itself in a situation that, despite appearances, makes it much more difficult to break with the figuration that would seem to be its miserable reserved domain. Abstract painting attests to this difficulty. The extraordinary work of abstract painting was necessary in order to tear down art away from figuration. But is there not another path, more direct and more sensible? Chapter 3, Athleticism. First movement from the structure to the figure, isolation, athleticism. Second movement from the figure to the structure, the body escapes from itself, abjection, contraction, dissipation, wash basins, umbrellas, and mirrors. Let us return to Bacon's three pictorial elements: the large fields as a spatializing material figure, the figures and their fact, and the place, that is the round area, the ring, or the contour, which is a common limit of the figure and the field. The shape of the contour seems to be very simple, round or oval. It is rather its color that poses problems because of the dynamic double relationship in which it is caught up. The contour as a place is in fact the place of an exchange in two directions, between the material structure and the figure, and between the figure and the field. The contour is like a membrane through which the double exchanges flows. The contour is like a membrane through which this double exchange flows. Something happens in both directions. If painting has nothing to narrate and no story to tell, something is happening all the same, which defines the functioning of the painting. Within the round area, the figure is sitting on the chair, lying on the bed, and sometimes it even seems to be waiting for what is about to happen. But what is happening, or is about to happen, or has already happened, is not a spectacle or a representation. In Bacon, these waiting figures or attendants are not spectators. One discovers in Bacon's paintings an attempt to eliminate every spectator and consequently every spectacle. Thus, the 1969 bullfight exists in two versions. In the first, the large field still includes an open panel through which we can glimpse a crowd like a Roman legion at an amphitheater. But the second version closes off this panel but the second version closes off this panel and is no longer content merely to intertwine the two figures of of the toreador and the bull, but truly achieves the unique or common fact which at the same time the mob strips disappears, which linked the spectators to what was still a spectacle. 3 studies of Isabel Rawsthorn shows a figure closing the door on an intruder or visitor, even if this is its own double. In many cases, there seems to subsist, distinct from the figure, a kind of spectator, a voyeur, a photograph, a passerby, an attendant, notably but not exclusively. In the triptychs, there is almost a law. However, we will see that in his paintings, and especially in his triptychs, Bacon needs the function of an attendant, which is not a spectator but part of the figure. Even the simulacra of the photographs hung on a wall or a railing can play this role as an attendant. They are attendants not in the sense of spectators, but as a constant or point of reference in relation to which a variation is assessed. The sole spectacle is in fact the spectacle of waiting or effort. But these are produced only when there are no longer any spectators. This is where Bacon resembles Kafka. Bacon's figures is a great scandal of the great swimmer who does not know how to swim, the champion of abstinence. And the ring, the amphitheater, the platform is the theater of Oklahoma. In this respect, everything in Bacon reaches its culmination in the painting of 1978. Stuck onto a panel, the figure tenses its entire body and a leg in order to turn the key in the door with his foot from the other side of the painting. We note that the contour of the round area, a very beautiful golden orange, is no longer on the ground but has migrated and is now situated on the door itself, so that the figure seems to be standing on the vertical door of the extreme point of the foot in a reorganization of the entire painting. In his attempt to eliminate the spectator, the figure already demonstrates a singular athleticism, of all the more singular in that the source of the movement is not in itself. Instead, the movement goes from the material structure, from the field to the figure. In many paintings, the field is caught up in a movement that forms it into a cylinder. It curls around the contour, around the place, and it envelopes and imprisons the figure. The material structure around the contour in order to imprison that figure, which accompanies the movement of all these structures' forces. It is the extreme solitude of the figures, the extreme confinement of the bodies, which excludes every spectator. The figure becomes a figure only through this movement, which confines it and in which it confines itself. A board, open brackets, a board where lost bodies roam, each searching for its lost one, inside a flattened cylinder, 50 meters round and 18 high for the sake of harmony. The light, its dimness, its yellowness, either the fall is suspended in the black hole of the cylinder. This is the first formula for a derisory athletics, a violent comedy in which the bodily organs are prostheses, or else the contour becomes an apparatus for the figure's gymnastics on the fields of color. But the other movement, which obviously coexists with the first, is on the contrary the movement of the figure toward the material structure, toward the field of color. From the start, the figure has been a body, and the body has a place within the enclosure of the round area. But the body is not simply waiting for something from the structure, it is waiting for something inside itself. It exerts an effort upon itself in order to become a figure. Now it is inside the body that something is happening. The body is a source of movement. There is no longer the problem of the place, but rather of the event. If there is an effort and an intense effort, it is in no way an extraordinary effort, as if it were a matter of undertaking something above and beyond the strength of the body and directed towards a separate object. The body exerts itself in a very precise manner or waits to escape from itself in a very precise manner. It is not I who attempt to escape from my body, it is a body that attempts to escape from itself by means of, in short, a spasm, the body as plexus, and its effort or waiting for a spasm. Perhaps this is Bacon's approximation of horror or abjection. There is one painting that can guide us, the figure at a wash basin from 1976. Clinging to the oval of the wash basin, its hands clutching the faucets, the body figure exerts an intense motion. The body figure exerts an intense motionless effort upon itself in order to escape down the blackness of the drain. Joseph Conrad described a similar scene in which he too saw the image of abjection in the hermetic cabin of the ship during a wild tempest. The nigger of the Narcissus hears the other sailors who have succeeded in carving a small hole in the bulkhead that imprisons him. It is one of Bacon's paintings. The infamous nigger rushed at the hole, puts his lips into it, and whispered, "Help," in an almost extinct voice. He pressed his head to it, trying madly to get out through that opening 1 inch wide and 3 inches long. In our disturbed state, we were absolutely paralyzed by this indescribable action. It seemed impossible to drive him away. The standard formula, to pass through the eye of a needle, trivializes this abomination or destiny. It is a scene of hysteria. The entire series of spasms in Bacon is of this type, scenes of love, of vomiting and excreting, in which the body attempts to escape from itself through one of its organs in order to rejoin the field or material structure. Bacon has often said that in the domain of figures, the shadow has as much presence as the body, but the shadow acquires this presence only because it escapes from the body. The shadow is the body that has escaped from itself through some localized point in the contour, and the scream, Bacon's scream, is the operation through which the entire body escapes through the mouth, all the pressures of the body. The bowl of the wash basin is a place, a contour. It's a replication of the round area. But here, the new position of the body in relation to the contour shows that we have arrived at a more complex aspect, even if this aspect was there from the start. It is no longer the material structure that curls around the contour in order to envelope the figure. It is the figure that wants to pass through a vanishing point in the contour in order to dissipate into the material structure. This is the second direction of the exchange and the second form of a derisory athletics. The contour thus assumes a new function, since it no longer lies flat but outlines a hollow volume and has a vanishing point. Bacon's umbrellas in this respect are analogues of the wash basin. In the two versions of painting, 1946 and 1971, the figure is already lodged within the round area of a balustrade, but at the same time it lets itself be grabbed by the half-spherical umbrella and appears to be waiting to escape in its entirety through the point of the instrument. Already we can no longer see anything but its abject smile. In Studies of the Human Body from 1970 and Triptych May-June, the green umbrella is treated more like a surface, but the crouching figure uses it all at once as a pendulum, a parachute, a vacuum cleaner, and a nozzle through which the entire contracted body wants to pass, and which has already grabbed hold of the head. The splendor of these umbrellas as contours with one point stretched downwards. In literature, it is William Burroughs who has best evoked this effort of the body to escape through a point or through a hole that forms a part of itself or its surroundings. Open quote. Johnny's body begins to contract, piling up towards his chin. Each time the contraction is longer, the boy yells. Every muscle tense, his whole body strains to empty through his cock. Close quote. In much the same way, Bacon's lying figure with hypodermic syringe from 1963 is less a nailed-down body, though this is how Bacon describes it, than a body attempting to pass through the syringe and to escape through this hole or vanishing point functioning as a prosthesis organ. In the ring or the round area, is replicated in the wash basin, and the umbrella, the cube or the parallelepiped, is also replicated in the mirror. Bacon's mirrors can be anything you like except a reflecting surface. The mirror is an opaque and sometimes black thickness. Bacon does not experience the mirror in the same way as Lewis Carroll. The body enters the mirror and lodges itself inside it, itself and a shadow, hence the fascination. Nothing is behind the mirror, everything is inside it. The body seems to elongate, flatten, or stretch itself out into the mirror, just as it is contracted itself by going through the hole. If need be, the head is split open by a large triangular crevice, which will reappear on two sides and disperse the head through the mirror like a lump of fat in a bowl of soup. But in both these cases, the umbrella and the wash basin, as much as the mirror, the figure is no longer simply isolated but deformed, sometimes contracted and aspirated, sometimes stretched and dilated. This is because the movement is no longer than that of the material structure curling down the figure. It is the movement of the figure going toward the structure, and which at the limit tends to dissipate into the fields of color. The figure is not simply the isolated body, but also the deformed body that escapes from itself. What makes deformation a destiny is that the body has a necessary relationship with the material structure. Not only does the material structure curl around it, but the body must return to the material structure and dissipate into it, thereby passing through or into these prostheses, instruments which constitute passages and states that are real, physical, and effective, and which are sensations and not imaginings. Thus, in many cases, the mirror or the wash basin can be localized. But even when what is happening in the mirror or what is about to happen in the wash basin can be immediately related to the figure itself. When the mirror shows, what the mirror shows or what the wash basin heralds is exactly what happens to the figure. The heads are all prepared to receive these deformations, hence the wiped, scrubbed, or rubbed out zones in the portraits of heads. And to the degree that the instruments tend to occupy the whole of the material structure, they no longer even need to be specified. The entire structure can play the role of a virtual mirror, a virtual umbrella, or wash basin, to the point where the instrumental deformations are immediately transferred to the figure. Thus, in the 1973 self-portrait of the man with the pig's head, the deformation takes place on the spot, just as the effort of the body is exerted upon itself. So the deformation is static. An intense movement flows through the whole body, a deformed and deforming movement that at every moment transfers the real image onto the body in order to constitute the figure. Thus, in many cases, the mirror or the wash basin can be localized. But even then, what is happening in the mirror or what is about to happen in the wash basin can be immediately related to the figure itself. What the mirror shows or what the wash basin heralds is exactly what happens to the figure. The heads are all prepared to receive those deformations, hence the wiped, scrubbed, or rubbed out zones in the portraits of heads. And to the degree that the instruments tend to occupy the whole of the material structure, they no longer even need to be specified. The entire structure can play the role of a virtual mirror, a virtual umbrella, or wash basin, to the point where the instrumental deformations are immediately transferred to the figure. Thus, in the 1973 self-portrait of the man with the pig's head, the deformation takes place on the spot, just as the effort of the body is exerted upon itself. So the deformation is static. An intense movement flows through the whole body, a deformed and deforming movement that at every moment transfers the real image onto the body in order to constitute the figure. In Studies of the Human Body from 1970 and Triptych May-June from 1974, the green umbrella is treated more like a surface, but the crouching figure uses it all at once as a pendulum, a parachute, a vacuum cleaner, and a nozzle through which the entire contracted body wants to pass and which has already grabbed hold of the head. The splendor of these umbrellas are as contours with one point stretched downwards. In literature, it is William Burroughs who has best evoked this effort of the body to escape through a point or through a hole that forms a part of itself or its surroundings. Open quote, Johnny's body begins to contract, pulling up towards his chin. Each time the contraction is longer. Wee! The boy yells, every muscle tense. His whole body strains to empty through his cock. Close quote.